Welcome students to the online NPTEL course Contemporary Architecture and Design. So this is the first lecture of the Contemporary Architecture and Design, and many of you might be from architecture background, few of you might be from design background, and few of you might be from arts background. We will discuss this contemporary art, architecture and design in a holistic way. So this course is not just focused on architecture or design and art, but here we will discuss a continuity in these three paradigms and how these three paradigms were evolved into the contemporary era, which is we are discussing from post-industrial revolution, and all these three paradigms, how they are connected. So we already know that the Bauhaus movement was connected with the Des Style movement or the Des Stil movement, the way you pronounce it. So they are quite together, and they were their styles were quite similar, and there are many other movements which we will discuss in the lectures, that which were parallel art movement, architecture movement and industrial design movements were there. So here we will focus on these three different domains, but what we'll not focus on is the structural part of architecture. We'll talk about the visual part of these movements, so how aesthetics principles were the key features of all these movements. So there were maybe the construction styles and techniques, construction tools, the materials were evolved into to generate some architecture style, which we will not focus on that. We will talk about the visual and the visual principles of all these different movements and how they were there in the different from architecture as well as in the industrial design and the art movement. We are talking about the contemporary architecture and design, which is the continuum of the history of architecture and design. So it's not one particular time which is industrial design movement, it's all of everything changed. Yes, it changed the form and the way of thinking, and there's a total paradigm shift of the previous one, which is then from the classical style and this the other movements like Gothic and other movements, and then Renaissance and the post-Renaissance. All these styles, there was a up and down, and then different styles came and different style faded away. And but industrial design, after industrial design, there was a lot of drastic changes in the style that we will discuss from there. But to connect with the style, how everything changed, we will discuss in the first the next lecture, and today we'll start, and the next lecture we will talk about the history, how history was there in the architecture as well as the design, and different movements in history is influenced in architecture, and at that time we'll also talk about the art movements, and it is there so that you can connect the history with the contemporary styles, because all of a sudden everything, a lot of things change, but everything is also, there's some continuity which is connection, the connection is there from the history. Because it's a continuum and the connected thing, we'll talk about it there, and we will discuss this course in a way of timeline. So throughout the time, how things changed. We'll not discuss this course based on a particular architect or painter or particular designer's work and his journey. We'll not discuss it like that. We'll discuss it like how the social things changed, and then how the style changed, and throughout the time, and the style holistically, how and we'll discuss about one style and all the architects and designers work into a one style, and then we'll go to the next style, and how this new style has an relation between the previous style, and whether it is a continuity of the previous style or whether it is opposing the previous style in a visual principle. That will be the main focus of the discussion. And so it's very important to know why style change. So there can be many factors for changing a style from one style to another style. So one of the very key things are like the changes of the mentality and the behavior of the people, how people's behavior changes. So that's why the need changes, and that's why that effects in the style, and that was the manifestation of changing a particular style. And sometimes it might be people might get there might be a visual fatigue, or people might get bored with a particular style, and then they want to do a complete opposite of the what is going on. So that might also be a change of the style. So one is the utility, which is like the social structure. For example, when there was World War going on, so there were a lot of influence in the architecture and design as well, because the socio cultural structure was influenced by the war. Which is also part of the during the contemporary, some major events was like World War I and World War II, which is post 1920s. So 1920s on was the World War I, and 1940s this World War II. So this affected the style. And then also the fatigue, which is also the previous style has exaggeration of a particular thing and concept, then the next style might just oppose that, and so visually it might be drastically different. And also the new construction technique and new tools and technique in art and design, and the new way of living. So everything together is an effect of the change of a style. So we know about the architect Vitruvius. So he made a triangle of a particular optimum design solution. So this is called Vitruvian triad. So he talked about the optimum design solution can lie in three things, which he talks. He says formitas, utilitas, and venustus. So venustus is the form or the aesthetic thing, which comes from the Italian goddess Venus, the goddess of beauty. And then structure, which is formitas, and then utilitas is the function. So function is there, structure is there, and the form. So this is the aesthetics. So if there is a particular style going on in the current phase, so they have a particular aesthetics, the next style generally will oppose that particular aesthetics, because there will be overpowering over example of the particular style, and then they will go opposite, and then it might be a different style which will come up as a reaction or the movement against the previous one. So that might be a one condition which comes from aesthetics or the form. The next is the structure or the formitas, which comes generally, which is closely related with the material and new construction technique. So in 1920s onwards, the post-industrial evolution, there were a lot of different changes of in the technology, which started from the Renaissance, and then which got accumulated with the Renaissance knowledge, and then the new style and the new construction technique was evolved during the industrial evolution. So that's why all the industries and everything was coming up, and then especially from the Europe, people started migrating, and then colonialization started. So all this thing was there during the industrial movement. So we know that science and technology was at highest level in the European country. So there was a structural and the material change, which also evolved into the different shift of style. So we might not go deep into the structure and technology change, but with the structural and technology change, there will be a clear shift in the visual. For example, we will see a lot of steel and glass cantilever structures which started coming up because of the new knowledge of the technology. Shell structures, concrete shells, which is there, and the glass steel, which gives a total different visual look into the style. So that is what also the styles like internationalism, Bauhaus, they evolved from the new material and new technology. Now another thing is function. So function might be similar for different things, but there are many movements which evolved from the function, and there was a after industrial evolution, there was a need for different kind of buildings. For example, people started migrating from village to the city. That's why tall high-rise buildings started coming, and we can see in the Chicago style movement we will discuss, and Art Deco movements, they have this kind of new style of office buildings were there. Even the like railway stations and all this kind of buildings, airports started coming up later, and then the studio apartments, the houses, and the modular style of design all these things came from the function. And after post-war world war, there was a Japanese movement of metabolism, which totally was driven from the function and the shift of people's behavior. That also there in the industrial design. For example, this wall cabinet started coming, and one of the famous designer George Nelson started designing this. So modular wall cabinet, which we see in the kitchen, and the storage wall. So this all modular cast thing in the architecture, or the modular pre-designed modules were there in the design as well. So from all these three perspectives, as total in holistically, the style might change. So structure is dependent on the new material, advancement of technology. Form is dependent on the perception of beauty, which changes based on the reaction against the previous style. So if the previous style has a particular emphasis on a particular style, like if there's a lot of curvilinear exaggeration of design is there in the previous style, next style might be a very rectilinear and clean and sleek. So this might be a reaction against the previous to the next style, which we will understand better when we start discussing the previous style. For example, in the history also this happened. So this is not just a particular characteristics from contemporary design. So this also happened in the history, which we will discuss. And then in the function approach, the social, economic change, the cultural change, and the behavioral factors, like the way people behave in a particular they use the building or the furniture, or they can be a pivotal they can play a pivotal role in the shift of design style. Now, Donald Norman, who's a contemporary designer, talked about the three level of design, which also has a quite connection. It's pretty connected with the Vitruvian triangle. So he talked about the behavior, three aspects or three levels of design. One is the behavioral factors of design, which is usability, and the design, which is the functional characteristics. Another is the visceral character of the design, which is aesthetic. Both the things are part of the form, which is aesthetic. So he is dividing aesthetics into the two things. One is the visceral aesthetics quality, and another is the reflective quality. So what is visceral quality? He is talking about the visceral is the eternal natural law. It comes from eternal natural laws of beauty. So all this proportion, ideal proportion, and rhythm, rhyme, balance, which we see, which we read in the visual design, like basic design principles, they create this visceral quality of a design, and that can be constant throughout a particular design. So if we are talking about Parthenon, the Greek architectural example Parthenon, so there has to be a proper proportion. So that is a classical example. Now if we talk about the Mona Lisa, which is a Renaissance painting by Leonardo da Vinci, there also the classical proportion is there, but it's a totally different time frame. So Mona Lisa is definitely not a classical painting, it's a Renaissance painting. Now also in the Baroque style, when Titian and others are painting something, then also they are following a particular proportion. And also in the modernist style, Picasso is painting and everything, we see a particular proportion. That's why this looks beautiful. Even in the modern buildings like Louis Icon's building, they have a particular proportion and symmetry and everything. This is followed. So that makes a building or the design or the painting beautiful. So that quality is there, which is aesthetic quality and visceral quality of the aesthetics, which is eternal, and which does not change. So all these principles of design and the visual ergonomics. So visual ergonomics, you can read about visual ergonomics, which we will not discuss here, but there are some principles I perceive a particular fonts or the proportion in a particular way, so that does not change. And also this eternal proportion, they does not change in particular if the style change, so they remain constant. So this thing is one particular thing which does not change throughout the style, but one component of the visual aesthetics which changes when the style changes. For example, that is what is calling as a reflective quality of the style. So style of a contemporary time, that changes in the perception of a beauty. For example, if we consider a classical chair or a very modern chair, so we will clearly understand this classical chair is which has a very ornamental way of designing things, or some exaggerated qualities with a lot of filigree works or other ornamentation in the design. And then it's a very clean sleek chair. So we will already know that this chair is much more modern, and is talking about the contemporary style. So this is the reflective quality which is dividing the two different chairs. So one, we can understand that this is in today's time, and this is old fashioned, but it might be the visual quality which might tell both the chairs are has a beautiful proportion. So reflective quality changes when the style changes, but the visual quality is a eternal proportion, which for that quality we like the design and like the proportion of the style, proportion of the product or architecture, but the reflective quality tells about which is the contemporary thing or which is not. So, and why all these things? While discussing this course, we will discuss this a particular style, and how this particular style is there in architecture, or in furniture design or the product design, and also in art. So mainly during this discussion we'll focus on architecture, so which will be the protagonist of the discussion, and then we will also talk about the other the same style, how this same style was there in the other movements, other paradigms in industrial design as well as art. So why this is happening? Because from the earlier time, architects and designers are working in a very close setup, so they used to talk to each other. So that's why this style which is there in architecture can convert it into the design, or the vice versa, the style which is there in the design can percolate in the architecture. And many of the cases where architects himself or herself is designing some product and furniture. For example, in even in today's time, we see this Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Gerrit Rietveld, and as well as Zaha Hadid. They have designed furniture as well, and which was also there in the previous time. So we know that Da Vinci was also a scientist. His influence there in the science as well as the art. And Michelangelo is one of the great example, who painted the Sistine Chapel, who also designed part of the St. Peter's Cathedral. So there was a lot of connection between the architects and the designers and the painters. So here also in the contemporary time, Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier mostly worked in the modern time, and Gerrit Rietveld also the style or the digital movement, and Zaha Hadid is a very is a deconstructive architect, and also Philip Stark. Philip Stark is predominantly, most of his works are there in the industrial design, but also he was a architect. And then Karim Rashid is also there in from industrial design background, and also was an architect. Gerrit Rietveld was also a similar example. So their work was there in various domains, and that's why there was a connection between industrial design and or the design and art architecture movement. Now this is the timeline of modern of the classical movement, and later into the next class we will discuss in detail how this particular styles which was pre-industrial revolution got changed, and we will see a similar kind of principle of shifting our different style in the contemporary style. So after industrial revolution is 19th century, modernism and postmodernism came. So together this is contemporary, we call it a contemporary style. Contemporary style. And so modern contemporary in a holistic way is a industrial revolution. After industrial revolution there was two movements, which is for the machine movement and against the machine movement, because of the turmoil which evolved from an industrial revolution and the colonialization. So these two movements was a short period before modernist and this pre-industrial revolution movement. There was a short two movement which was poles apart, and they were very opposite to each other. And after that the modern movement started and the postmodern movement started, but together modern and postmodern is called contemporary. Sometimes within the postmodern movement there are a few movements like critical regionalism and deconstructive style. They were seen outside postmodern, but in a generic way we can see those are also part of the postmodern style. So before that, if we look at, so we start with the classical. We will not discuss the prehistoric styles, which was very different in Egypt, Babylon, and other prehistoric architecture style. So after that, the historic movements were there. So there we have Egyptian architecture, Indus Valley civilization, Chinese, but we are not discussing that because this contemporary style evolved in Europe. So we start with the European history. So in European history, we have Greek architecture, Roman architecture. Greek was mainly trabeated. Roman started making the arches, and then the early Christians. So we see a lot of examples of churches and other things, and then they started making this architecture of this church, which the plan is like typically a cross like thing. And then we see the Byzantine, where we see the Byzantine arch, the pendentive arch, and this style which is there in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, that kind of structure. So this is a structural change, and the construction technique change. So where first we started with the trabeated form. So this is Greek, with they talked about the proportion, Doric, Ionic, and all these columns. And Romans started making arches, and when you rotate the arch, it becomes a dome. So they made arch and dome, so which and they started making using the concrete, which they got from the Vesuvius, and then kind of those ashes from the magmas and all this. So they made the concrete. They used the concrete first, and then this was the structural change they have brought after Greek. And then after Byzantine, there's a Romanesque, which is similar to Roman, but the change is there, which is like they started making a cross vault. So there was a vault. So then if they make a cross vault, and then this making a church becomes very easy. So this cross vault is in plan. You will see this cross is going. Now you can add this part in this part, and then you can have a vaulted structure, but two vaults are penetrating each other. So that's what you can get, a cross vault. So here you will make the cross vault, and two vaults will go penetrate each other. So that's what they have made in the Romanesque, this cross vault. Then in Gothic, you will see a new style of this. They started making the facade very light, and then this huge Byzantine glasses and the Gothic painted glasses were there. So the facade of the church becomes very light. That's why to support that they made buttress, which is flying buttress from there, and on top of that they put the pinnacles. So you see this Gothic styles, which is with the pinnacles and buttress. And here the ornamentation becomes very high. So it's high on ornamentation. Roman, this Greek and Roman was it's low. There are ornamentation, but if you look at the classical style, so they were not as high as Gothic. So Gothic goes in peak in the ornamentation, which is the just before the Renaissance. After that, 1940 to 70, this Renaissance starts. So it's pre-Renaissance, and then after that the post-Renaissance. Renaissance is the enlightenment, the movement which started in the Europe. So they flourished in different domains of art, science, and as well as literature, the painting, literature, science in different domains, and technology. So that shifted the architectural spectrum as well, the painting spectrum as well. So there was a Renaissance architecture. Renaissance architecture, if we look at the Brunelleschi's design and their designs, so they again become a very geometric and less in ornamentation. So it's very geometric, the Brunelleschi's dome and the other designs, which are Duomos and the Renaissance Duomos. So they were very sleek and minimal in design. Then started Mannerism. So Mannerism started using the different manner of the style and started mimicking the style. So we will see dome and arch or columns, which was just as a facade treatment, and it's nothing structural. So they are started using a different elements, which is just for visuals, and then there will be keystones which is protruding down, so this is not taking any load. So this kind of things will be there just for decorating the thing. Then Baroque and Rococo is a very different kind of movement where it again went very high in ornamentation. So if you look at Baroque and Rococo painting and architecture, a lot of filigree works and chiaroscuro work, and then change in light and shadow, and the use of gold and floral patterns were very high in Baroque and Rococo architecture. Then there was a neoclassical again, a different style which is classical, but again change of classical style which is shift from Baroque Rococo again going down, and then totally in the modernism again it becomes a very less minimal architecture style, and postmodern again up in visual style. So there's like minimalism and then the exaggeration, again minimalism, exaggeration. This goes on in the history which was getting continued in the contemporary architecture as well. So these are the architectural examples. So Greek is trabeated, then the dome, which we see in the Pantheon in Rome. The early Christian, when there's this kind of architecture style was there. The Byzantine, the pendentive vault, and the dome was a different kind of dome was there. The Romanesque, where this cross vaults are there. The Gothic, if you look at the Gothic architecture style, this Notre Dame Chapel of Paris. So you look, you can see a lot of ornamentation, the rose windows and all the flying buttresses and the pinnacles are quite exaggerated. And this is the Florence Cathedral by Bruno Leschi, and this is Renaissance, and again you can see there's no ornamentation over here. So this is the structural members are just shown here. Looking if you look at the facade, this facade treatment is very minimal instead of this, and the major parts does not have any ornamentation. It's like the structure is exposed. Then the mannerism, here you can see this mannerist design. So here trabeated with arches and everything is combined, and it's just a facade treatment. So this is a load bearing wall, and then the columns are added and the keystones are protruding down. So all these things are there. Then Baroque and Rococo, you can clearly see how ornate this is, this Baroque and Rococo style. So this is again high on ornamentation, low on ornamentation, and again high on ornamentation. Then neoclassical is the revival of the classical style, and modern again low on ornamentation, postmodern is high on ornamentation. So now if you look at the paintings, so this is Roman paintings. They have all these works on the wall, and the early Christian paintings talks about the mostly it is the Christianity and all these stories and fresco on wall. And the Byzantine is also has a different style which changed from the early Christian style, and all this work with on the wall is there. And the Romanesque style is also the painting. So here in together you can see, and also in the Gothic glass works are there. There are a lot of there's this change of they're quite similar. And then if you look at here, so all these human figures here, and they don't have a perspective, like the perspective in the sense of like the farther point elements will be shorter. It's like painted on top of each other, so as in the glass paintings, all the fresco works on the wall. And only the technique of painting changed in the different styles. So based on their material, Byzantine glasses, and the wall, the mosaic. So this is used by a mosaic tiles. So they have kept different mosaic tiles on top of each other. So this is actually a mosaic work. So that technique changed, but the concept remained quite similar. And then the thematically it is all Bible and those stories. But after Renaissance, there was change in the conceptual change of the style. So here in the this is Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. The proportions by the beautiful proportions, the ideal proportion was explored. And you can see a human eye perspective. So it's not painted, the animals and figures are not painted on top of each other. There's a human eye perspective, and how we see the paintings or the natural elements. So there's a natural, a realistic way of doing it. And also there's in the Renaissance there was a key feature that human became quite important, and the power of pope and cathedral came down. So the way humans see, that was also explored. With the perspective was one of the key invention in the painting, so that real perspective was used. In the mannerism, what happened in the painting, so there's a exaggeration and elongation of the figure. So these figures, if you look at, so they have they're not in a proper human proportion. So you can see the neck is bended in a particular way, and this figure is quite elongated, so it's not a human proportion, so it's elongated to make it beautiful. The way architecture was done in the facade treatment was done to beautify it, so this beautiful proportions. And then every figure has a particular aesthetical proportion and posture was explored. So this has a particular aesthetic posture, so it was freezed in a particular beautiful posture. It was like that. And then Baroque and Rococo style, this is the last maniness. So you can see a lot of chiaroscuro work in there. So it's chiaroscuro is a term which is used for the juxtaposition of light and shadow. So you can see a lot of dark, and all of a sudden there's one particular focus light is there in the painting. So you can see in the backdrop also it's happening. So here in the other painting, so backdrop is almost merged, and then the foreground has an illumination, but here a lot of things are happening. So there's a clear illumination in this canvas where the painter himself is painting. And then there's a king which is coming who's coming from the backdrop, but there's a lot light in the backdrop, and then there's a light here, but the other figures does not have the light. So this interplay of light and shadow is there, which was there in architecture to for the interplay of lot of works, filigree works, and then intricate works are there. So here the intricacy is translated in the painting in this way. Neoclassical also has a posture, so particular postures, has a very dramatic way of positions of each and every figures, where is a particular dramatic sculptural way. The classical, the way Roman sculptures were there in the previous time. So in the classical time, the Roman marble sculptures, it looks like marble sculptures freezed in a particular position, and everybody's posture is very defined. So similarly it was there in the mannerism, but mannerism there was an elongation and change of proportion. And then the modern and postmodern style came. So we'll discuss this architecture and painting styles in detail in the next class, and then we'll move on to the main part, which is contemporary architecture and design.